Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of House Chronicle. No greater issue faces humanity than global warming, climate change, call it what you will, with the attendant disasters that go with it, from droughts to sea level rise. The evidence is in. I don't think there's much doubt. There are a few people who say that it's a natural phenomenon. More scientists believe it is the carbon, primarily, and other gases that we put into the air, largely but not exclusively, in generating electricity. On the program today, we have three people from the same company, Guidehouse, a very influential consulting company that works where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in climate and utilities, in advocating and introducing new technologies, new ways of looking at how generators do business. Our guests are, and I'm very glad to have them, I might say, our guests today are Karen Wilson, a partner in energy, sustainability, and infrastructure at Guidehouse. Welcome to the broadcast, Karen.
Thank you for having us.
Ted Walker. Ted is a partner, energy, sustainability, and infrastructure at Guidehouse.
Thanks for having me.
And McKinnon Lawrence, Director, Energy, Sustainability, and Infrastructure at Guidehouse. You have pretty big titles at Guidehouse. Do you have very big responsibilities to go with those titles back?
Well, I think just keying off your intro, I would say absolutely. I think the challenges are many and they're big. So, you know, just from a day-to-day perspective, I think the challenges that we're working on with our clients tend to lead us in many different directions.
Karen, you've had a large background, I know, in dealing with the federal government. Who do you deal with now in your client interface in pursuit of a cleaner energy society?
Yes, most of our clients are the ones that are responsible for our nation's infrastructure and natural resource management, such as the Departments of Interior, Transportation, Agriculture, Commerce, and the like.
And what is their attitude? There's some tension in the federal government over climate change. Day to day, are they on the same page?
Yes, without speaking for the federal government and certainly not wading into policy, I think there's a lot of people in these agencies that are very focused on spending the resources that they have wisely and making the best use out of those, both to save resources, to conserve resources, and to direct them in the right direction.
Ted, Guidehouse uses the term energy cloud. Explain that, if you would, please.
Sure. When we think about the energy system of today, and really for the last century, the energy system is largely characterized by one-way energy flows. So it's easy to think about the electric system. One-way flows, central generation flowing to its customers.
It comes out of where you make it, goes to the customer, that's the one way.
Right, and there's one-way flows of power, there are one-way flows of information, and one-way flows of financials back. And so we see that's, you know, the central tenets for that are safe, affordable, reliable. We see the energy cloud moving when you have a proliferation of distributed energy resources, which are things like distributed solar, storage, even electric vehicles.
Distributed means local.
Distributed means local, moving from very large-scale generation to local at your neighborhood, even at your home or business.
And Mac, local means rooftop solar, windmills down the street, etc.
Yeah, there's kind of a sliding definition, but generally it's going to be sited at the customer point of connection to the grid, but it could be anywhere from inside the home. You know, we're talking about demand response technologies where, you know, folks are responding to price signals and adjusting their thermostats within their home, all the way to, as you mentioned, rooftop solar or small sided wind on those facilities as well. You can even include microgrids as well, is another category of distributed energy resources.
So the energy cloud is that energy will be coming from many places,
Right.
flowing both ways and maybe more than both ways,
Multi-way.
in the same line, in the same electric line that we're so used to at the top of a pole down the street.
Right. And with that, you also have those two-way, multi-way flows of information and multi-way flow of finances, of money going back and forth.
Information is the new gold, isn't it?
It is.
Also known as data is the new gold.
Mm-hmm.
How does this work in electricity? We have smart meters in a lot of homes, more than 60% in America, maybe 70 now, the last time I looked. Smart meters help you see how you're using electricity, what time of day it's more propitious to use it, etc. What else do smart meters do? They generate a lot of data, and that sometimes frightens people. Ted?
We look at it a lot like analogous to the financial industry where it was a couple of decades ago. You don't actually, as a customer, you don't have a lot of interaction points with your utility on a regular basis, and generally those interactions are when there's a problem. So that's similar to the financial industry. You needed to get cash, you needed to cash a check. It was a problem. It was a pain. With digital, with a lot of the transformation of the business models, the number of touch points per month that a bank would have with its customer has gone from something like 1, 2, or 3 to, in some cases, 20 plus a month. You check your balance on your phone, things like that. We see the energy industry moving to something similar, where you have additional products and services that are not just, your utility is not just your commodity provider of electricity, but it's offering other products and services by which your interactions can grow, the quality of interactions, but also the number of interactions. Thinking about for example, your EV in your garage, being able to interact with
your electric vehicle.
Correct.
You need to know what it's doing, when it's charging, how charged it is,
exactly,
how many miles left on it, etc. Karen, you work a lot on infrastructure.
Yes.
Infrastructure means somewhat different things to different people. Immediately, to most of us, it means bridges and roads, period. But in fact, infrastructure is everything we use, isn't it?
That's right. It's the built environment, and when you're talking about government-owned or publicly managed assets.
The built environment, everything that man and woman, if we are going to be politically correct, let's be politically correct, have done to improve life.
That's right.
From the provision of telephone service to the provision of electricity.
That's right. And so when we're talking about publicly managed assets, it's everything from, as you said, roads and bridges, to buildings, to communications infrastructure, to transportation infrastructure across all modes, as well as space.
How much coordination is there in Washington between federal agencies and this existential threat that comes from climate change?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? It's such a sweeping organization. It's difficult to this point to have a cohesive view on how to address resiliency and sustainability.
In my reporting, of course, I learned that the Navy is very concerned about sea level rise. It almost seems funny. Why should the Navy be concerned about more water? But all down the East Coast, its installations are possibly in trouble. They may have to abandon some, relocate some. So you have clearly parts of the Pentagon very concerned, see that climate change is a national security threat. Other parts of the government less conscious of that.
It's true, and there is threat, of course, to coastal environments, and so you see cities and counties and states concerned with that as well. But we're also seeing threats to resiliency inland, because it's not just about the coastal water, right? It's more extreme heat and cold, it's droughts, it's river flooding. So really, it's something that governments are tackling at all levels around the country.
When we talk infrastructure, and I said we used to think of roads and bridges and walls, and we're going to have a lot of old-fashioned building focused on keeping the sea out. We're going to have to build walls around Manhattan, parts of Boston perhaps, and many other cities. What sort of stress does this put in the world of steel and concrete and planning and architecture?
Certainly, the macroeconomic trends are not something that can be pinned down, but I think what we work with our clients on is ways to both leverage new and more resilient materials, as well as to help coordinate governments, because that's a challenge when you have a municipality and a county and a state that may all be sharing the same port or the same coastal area. That's where the coordination is important, to have both public and private entities coming together.
Mac, we talk about solar panels on the roof. You can drive down the street and see more of them deployed all the time. I take the train up to Boston, I see solar panels on all sorts of unlikely buildings. Is that working? Is that economically favorable to the utility and the homeowner?
It's a great question. Is it working? I would say absolutely. I mean, you look at any of these technologies that are being deployed, they're being diffused into the market for a reason. I mean, they are effective. But I think we still tend to take a pretty simplistic view on what the potential of those technologies are, and that's the challenge we need to overcome. Is solar, whether we're talking about solar, whether we're talking about electric vehicles or microgrids or what have you, The performance of those assets is going to depend on where they're deployed. So, whether you're talking about Boston or down further south, you're going to have different efficiencies. And so part of the challenge we're wrestling with is how do we unleash, that full value of these distributed assets where they are, and coordinate that with the overall system. So, that's really the, if we're going to talk about how effective, that's a hurdle that needs to be overcome.
Would you encourage homeowners to put in solar panels? Or does it depend on where they live and the relationship with the local utility?
I think the latter, absolutely. I mean, it really does depend. It depends on, just the siting of the home, what's the sun exposure. But I think also solar panels, I will say, are not the only solution out there, right? I think we tend to, when we think about the energy transformation or decarbonization, we tend to go to solar because we all have a familiarity with that technology. What we like to talk a lot about with our clients is just the complexity of this system, because it isn't just about solar. And for a homeowner, there's many solutions out there in terms of what they could deploy inside their home. Could be solar plus storage plus smart thermostats. So there's a range of solutions available now today. And so, it's really being able to analyze what's most effective in that
But
site.
unquestionably, everyone watching this program or listening to it on the radio can do something.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it could be a small thing like reordering the amount of electricity they use to a substantial thing like covering the house in solar panels and maybe even getting the local authority to invest in a windmill, which has happened where I live. And how are the utilities? Ted, you know a lot about utilities. How are they receiving this? On this program, just a few short years ago, chief executives of electric utilities declined to say they believed in global warming. They wouldn't say they didn't believe in it, but clearly they felt very awkward making a statement that now that's changed.
Right.
Is that because there's been a generational change, or is that because society has gotten more upset about the possibility of a global warming?
No, and that's a great question, and obviously the industry, is somewhat divided on that. But what I think most CEOs would agree is there is massive disruption on the existing business model for utilities as a commodity energy supplier, and kind of staying in that bucket. There's a lot of challenges there. So we talk with a lot of executives about you need to bolster the existing grid, the existing model, but you also need to think about new products and services on top of that. So again, the customers are evolving. We see, not only residential customers, but also large commercial and industrial customers. Global companies have voluntarily signed on to carbon reduction targets. It's now a key part of their strategy. So now they're looking for how can we be more sustainable, putting pressure on utilities, or in some cases going around the utility to meet those goals. So it's a huge challenge, but also an opportunity for utilities to really think more broadly about solving some of their customers' problems and some of their emerging wants and needs.
What about combustion with coal? Coal is in decline as a demand fuel, and any of you answer this. It's in decline, but it's still burned in fairly large amount. And we have the option of technologies that may be able to allow us to burn coal by capturing the carbon and doing something else with it. One of the things they do with it is to stimulate the production of underground oil. But what about technologies to make coal burnable?
I can pick up on that. I think, this picks up on the point I made earlier. I think the conversation politically, as well as, I think from a public conversation perspective, tends to be very binary. It's fossil versus renewables. And we tend to go down that pathway, which I think does a disservice to the technologies that we have available. We look at it as a much more of a kaleidoscope of solutions that are out there, and not one single technology is necessarily going to solve, you talked about climate change in the beginning, any of those types of very large issues. So part of what we really look at is if we're going to talk about coal, how can you maybe make it more efficient from a carbon perspective with add-on technologies, and those are certainly being explored and should be explored. But then how do we augment that generation with other assets? We talked about distributed, as well as storage and all these other technologies that exist across the supply chain or from a grid perspective. The challenge is how do we get them to work in concert so they, we can create a more resilient system like we talked about from if we think about the grid as infrastructure, so it can withstand the local shocks or the the disruptions that may occur, whether it be just power outages or what have you.
We're going to take a short break for station identification, primarily for the benefit of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel, where this program can be heard 4 times every weekend. I am Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, and my guests today, all from the Guidehouse company, are Karen Wilson, Partner, Energy, Sustainability and Infrastructure at Guidehouse, Ted Walker, Partner, Energy, Sustainability and Infrastructure, obviously at Guidehouse, and last, Mickanan Lawrence, who goes by Mac, not least Director of Energy, Sustainability and Infrastructure. We are talking about the future of the electric industry, the changes coming to it, and how the future is going to be governed by perceptions and the reality of climate change, global warming, sea level rise. This program can be seen on 200 American television stations and around the world on both the radio broadcasts and the television broadcasts of the Voice of America. It is translated into Chinese by Voice of America. Back to our discussion. Sometimes when there's a problem, there's a solution, and everybody goes rushing after the solution, and the solution becomes a problem in itself. Are we going to do that, Ted? Are we in danger of doing that? Are we in danger of having too many windmills, too many solar things, too many gadgets in the house? What are the chances that we're overdoing it on renewables?
Well, I wouldn't call it overdoing. I echo Mac's comment that there's not one answer. As we move, we are going to be moving toward, if you really look to the next 3 decades, really looking to getting to 2050, kind of in accordance with some of the agreed upon the COP agreement. The pathway there can look very different. There is room for a lot of even coal within that pathway there, natural gas within that pathway there. But as you start to say, is renewables, for example, is renewables the answer? Are we going to have 100% solar and wind, 100% generation? If that happens, we need a lot of storage to handle those periods when the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine. So that cannot be necessarily the answer. That is not the answer. There's other solutions there to kind of get to that carbon-free scenario that's not just about solar and wind. So it's a mixed journey there.
To the panel, what's happening with nuclear? For 25 years, we've gotten about 20% of our electricity from carbon-free nuclear power. There's been controversy, but the plants have operated very well. Now they're being closed down because they're uneconomic. Isn't there something crazy about closing down carbon-free plants when we're trying to reduce the amount of carbon and going to natural gas, which is a carbon producer, although less than coal? To the panel, anybody, jump in.
I'm happy to jump in here. So I think this goes back to the comment Ted made earlier, just about when we talk about the energy cloud. We're essentially talking about that shift from centralized generation to decentralized generation, and nuclear certainly falls in that centralized generation category. It's it's expensive to build. Once you've built that asset and you're trying to pay it off over several decades, it's obviously exposed to all kinds of physical risk potentially. So there are challenges with that centralized generation fleet, and I think there's a tipping point that we often point to that really indicates kind of this phase we're in this transition. And in 2018, we took a look at the entire distributed energy resources landscape and found that there was more capacity of these distributed energy resources, solar, EVs, smart thermostats, microgrids, being deployed than centralized generation capacity. And that's a major shift from where we've been over the last 150 years. So I think nuclear kind of falls into that dynamic.
Karen, you all work for Guidehouse. You worked for Guidehouse a little longer than these gentlemen who worked for another company called Navigant, and now they're all one.
That's right.
Tell us about Guidehouse, and how do you approach clients? How does a consultancy help a client?
We try to be critical to the most pressing issues that our clients are facing. And when we talk about public sector clients, they are involved with protecting the public trust and solving important problems. So in the area of sustainability and resiliency, we're talking about municipalities, states, and federal governments that are entrusted with managing these assets. So they'll engage us to help with everything from strategy through execution. We're very proud of the work that we're able to do in support of that.
When you're invited into a utility, Ted, how do you go about? Do you start with analysis? Do you start with, I think you should do this, or this has worked very well over here, you should try it? How does that process function? How do you get the confidence of your client to follow your advice if that's what you're trying to get them to do?
Absolutely. Well, you really got to start with, it's kind of consulting 101. You got to start with knowing your client, knowing the situation they're in. A lot of our clients are publicly traded, so there's obviously a lot of information they're telling Wall Street, about their growth plans, et cetera. There, so knowing them, knowing the situation, we have a large regulatory practice that really understands the unique set of regulations that are within each jurisdiction across the different states. So understanding the situation they're in, and then there are seldom easy answers. There's not a cookie cutter answer because they're all very smart. They would they would already have that. So just really understanding that, then we can bring in some examples that we've seen in a lot of cases. Europe is further along what we call the energy transition than we are here in the U.S. So what are examples of some of the European players doing that maybe will help push the thinking? Maybe there is a different approach. Maybe there's something very innovative that we can.
So we're learning from Europe. Are we learning from Asia at all?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, yes. I think if you look at the, it's kind of a mixed bag, and there are a lot of technology improvements that are coming out. For example, there are cities in China that have 10,000 all-electric buses. So you have the scale of some of the clean technology investment.
In South Korea, there are buses that get recharged without any connection when they go through the bus stop.
Right.
They're taking on people, but they're also taking on electrons in an extraordinarily interesting and exciting world. Among these developments, are they going to save us? Are they in time, Mac?
Well, we have to hope that they will. I think we tend to look at it from, backing up to your question with Ted, thinking about it from a client perspective. Where's the opportunity? How do we navigate, this disruption and opportunity? And we tend to look at, I think, where there are, kind of a confluence of several things as the opportunities. So you talk about smart cities. That's a good example of where we see significant demand, essentially coalescing over time. We're going to have, by 2050, the entire population of the world today will be living in cities in 2050. So about 2/3 of the global population. You have technology diffusion in cities, and you have, a lot of cross-industry synergies that can be achieved. So when you look at those circumstances, it looks like a very attractive opportunity because we can advance many of these solutions, treat these areas as kind of test beds. In terms of how they work together, what kinds of business models we need to.
There are huge changes in the threat to utilities that weren't around 20 years ago. We've seen the utility in California, Pacific Gas and Electric, go into bankruptcy because inadvertently, during very dry weather and high winds, they started a lot of fires. This was not a threat. We never thought the utility would go bankrupt for starting fires. We thought that possibly of railroads at one time when we burned coal and steam engines, and they started a lot of fires. This is a new dimension. Cybersecurity, a new threat not previously known in the utility space at all, not totally comprehended any space as far as I can determine. Do these things speed up the change to the cloud, to the use of the resources that are in the cloud, this energy cloud with its many generations? And what is the answer there, Ted?
Well, it does, and another example is even Superstorm Sandy, how it really caused the utilities to think differently about some of their assets, literally on the ground or underground or close to the ground. But if you think the common theme we're seeing a lot is both with customers and utilities is resiliency. So it's reliability moving to resiliency. So how quick is the system designed to recover after an event? Obviously, it's different with the wildfires in California, but when you have a major event, is it weeks? Or can it get down to days? Because it can be designed for a higher level of resiliency built in.
We're moving towards smart cities, which are also totally electric cities. Cities are electrified today, but more so when everything depends on electricity. The transportation becomes electric instead of being fossil as it is primarily today. That means resiliency takes on a new urgency. It has been, in my experience, the habit of utilities to respond to disaster very quickly rather than to be able to preempt it. My wife and I, Linda Gasparella, we like to drive around looking at old utility poles all over the world. The most graphic are those, by the way, in Vietnam. But New England has some wonders of poles doing this, poles with braces, poles that look as though gravity will get them today. These are reminders that this is an old industry catching up. How fast is it moving? And who is paying for the changes? What do you think, Ted?
Well, it's actually a part of the strategic plan. The next 10 years for most utilities is what a lot of utilities will call grid modernization. It's really bringing the grid up to be.
Some of those poles should be in the Smithsonian.
Some of those poles are maybe older than all of us.
They're artifacts of great historical interest.
And so if you really look at 10, 15-year programs that they're investing billions of dollars in to modernize the grid, what we're working with a lot of our clients on is making sure that there is a strong customer value proposition. So what is the value to the customer? Because investing billions in the grid will only cause rates to go higher. But what value does that provide to individual customers, and how do you justify that? And kind of rewriting the step change for a utility. We call it Utility 2.0. And again, it's not just the grid, but it's also all the other emerging platforms on top of that.
Karen, how do you feel government, and in a sense I mean all of government, not the political administration of today,
Certainly.
dare I say it, the deep state government, the one that goes on all the time because it has to go on all the time, that one, how are they responding?
Well, to pick up on something that Mac said, I think some of the most exciting work that's happening is in municipalities and cities. The federal government is doing wonderful work, but it's so broad that it's hard to move as quickly as cities can. And so we're working with cities such as San Jose, which just won the American Climate Cities Challenge, because partners can come together. The utility, the government, and private partners like mobility providers, scooters, bikes, developers who all have the same interest.
Interesting how the cities are changing in front of us with scooters, Uber cars,
Right.
or Lyft, let's be fair to both, which actually I think have brought, Mac and I were discussing this once, they've democratized luxury. We all have that's our show for today. I thank this wonderful panel so much, Karen, Mac, and Ted, for coming along. The future is in our hands, so to speak, and the flip of a light switch, which, by the way, is one of the truly great democratic values if you have electricity at your home. Until next week, White House Chronicle bids you adieu.